So we got one. There's a switch actually. Did you try that? Oh.
Okay. It would seem that these other ones. Oh, there we go. I figured it out. There's like a little power. That's power. Okay. Test. 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 Is Tony awake? Testing. Okay. So I need a jabber scribe still. Are you gonna? You're gonna volunteer to jabber? Thank you. Thank you. Very appreciated. So this is the SECEVENT working group, IETF 100 Singapore. Please note well. Blue paper has gone around. Anybody not signed the blue paper? I think it's all over the place. And how do I even like? This is the right thing. Use that. There we are. Anybody else not signed the blue paper? Okay. Oh. So first item on our agenda is this the agenda? This work? Any agenda bashing? Else? Well, okay. Yeah. I think what I'd like to do is we have a number of presentations. I want to go through the material and maybe we have a little bit of discussion if we have time. Otherwise, let's push sort of the broader discussion to the end. Because I think there's a fair amount of open issues, which I was going to change my last item there. That's management API discussion is really going to be open issues discussion. And so the first person up is Phil, which is on set, let's see if I can go and make this work. There we go. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, let's go to the agenda slide, the next slide. So I basically wrote this presentation based on the draft 3 update. So I'll give you a little bit of background for the people who haven't been following all along. We'll look at the current status and where we got to the end of draft 3. There has been significant discussion about what to do going forward. And I'll push that to the end, and depending on time, we can have some discussion initially, and as Dick says, we'll do more later on. There's definitely a lot of discussion there. Next slide. So security events started about 2 years ago. We were looking at and observing in Tokyo that we were all writing drafts for logout, for token revocation, for skim events, for risk events, and Justin had another group for, I think it was healthcare consent called HEART. We were all using JOT, and the comment was, in Tokyo, maybe we can have a common foundation draft that sets out all the security considerations and privacy considerations in the basic format so that we could take current libraries for JOT and enhance them to do sets. And that would lay a foundation for other specs like HEART, like risk, to specify events that work in their communities. That design assumed independent development. There is no formal reconciliation mechanism. That was how it was started. Events themselves, something to point out that when at our first meeting, some people from the broader IETF community pointed out that there are very different perceptions on events. So some people believe an event is something like an antivirus thing where I've collected a bunch of data and drew a bunch of historical data and made a conclusion. That's one definition of an event. Another definition of event is it's a command that one party sends to another. Yeah, so this group is neither of those things. It's really simply one domain sending a trigger, a simple statement from one domain to another that can be interpreted by the receiving party to decide what to do. So we're kind of smack dab in the middle of doing that. There's lots of good reasons for that. If you think about major providers, don't necessarily want to talk a lot about how they came to a conclusion, nor do they want to be in the business of telling their competitor what to do. So SCIM kind of defines its event right down the middle. So the timeline at the bottom was this work. We started writing the drafts in November. We were initially looking at an AD-sponsored track, and then quickly after a joint meeting with the SCIM working group in Buenos Aires, decided to work on a charter for this group. And so now we are here today. Next slide.
Sorry.
So this is just listing the examples I just mentioned before. SCIM's perspective was that you had a RESTful API where a client wants to send changes and pull data from a service provider, but what we found was a need for the service provider to be able to send signals or triggers back to those clients so that the client can decide what to do about things. If you think about a service provider, they have many clients or thousands of clients, each introducing changes, and the service provider wants to coordinate some of those changes. In OAuth, we've been talking about but haven't started work on how do you revoke an access token. There is an RFC to tell the AS you want that token revoked, but there's no method right now for the AS to let the audiences know that that token was actually revoked. So that's a back channel. Not listed here is the back channel logout, which is simply how to facilitate a logout in a back channel. Risk is you have security systems want to share security generated events between parties. And then hard, as I mentioned, is the ability to share consent events in a signed format. So we'll go to the next.
Okay. Is there anybody representing Heart here? Okay.
Did I get that right, Justin? I just said it was ability to share consent events. It's a little more sophisticated. Justin
really
just says it's more or less the same.
I think, yeah, we should also spool through this background stuff so we can get to the set.
So let's, yeah. So for draft 2, there was a working group last call put out. We took the feedback from 02 and we generated an 03. As history, we've now had 4 working group drafts, and that was preceded by 8 individual draft updates starting from 2 years ago. As far as the implementation goes and the draft goes up until now, it's been what I would characterize as functionally stable. Next slide. There were a few editorial changes. There were a couple of old terms we had. We used to have publish and subscribe as a term, and there were a few leftover subscribe words left, so I fixed that. We clarified that an event receiver is in fact the same thing as JWT recipient. However, for editorial reasons, we decided to keep it consistent as transmitter receiver rather than actually switch over to recipient. So I made the clarification in the definitions. It was also brought up that we were redefining not before for a different purpose. And as a general rule, we've not liked that. So we decided to remove NBF and define something which is what people really wanted, which was time of event. This enables things such as if you notice a week later that something happened, like a password database was compromised, you can issue the event after the fact. So the time of the set and its issuance may not in fact correspond to what you believe the actual time of event. So if that's important, there's a registered claim in JOT now to do that. That's it. So this is the part that's happened since we posted 03. Thank you, Annabelle. And Annabelle's thought was, what if we just take the events attribute and make it singular? William Dennis pointed out that there may be some confusion that we have the word call the claim events, meaning there are multiple things inside that JSON attribute, but that we're still conveying one logical event. Annabelle would like to simplify it on both levels, I think, which is to say, make it singular so that it is one event and we are actually conveying only one set of information. The proposal also was that the extensions would be determined by the profiling spec as to how they want to handle it. We've had lots of discussion back and forth, and we can pick that up later. Next slide.
It's harder than it looks.
So basically, it's the same, except that you now have event, and you do not have multiple payloads. Instead, you have attributes of the event directly in. There's one specified attribute called an event type, which is how you indicate what type of event it is. And then any of the other things you want in there can be added in. So Annabelle had translated the skim example, and this is what it would look like with the new format. Next slide. So the argument was one event is simple, and that it's simple because some receivers don't know how to handle multiple payloads. They might get confused over which payload is the actual event or the primary event. And so processing multiple events is seen as complex for some. So I'll leave that there. And Annabelle can add to that later, because we're not always in sync on what I think she's after. So this was the comment that William made, that events does suggest multiple events, but if you look at the spec, it doesn't actually permit distinct repeat events, because you can't actually repeat the same event payload. You can only specify it once. So you couldn't actually say use a set to convey 5 separate transactions. You could convey 5 different pieces of information or n pieces of information about the same logical event. That works. That's allowed at the moment. Next slide. So the 03 draft, the way it's written, it kind of, my feeling is that the allowing multiple event URI payloads allows you flexibility with how you want to handle versioning, flexibility as to how you handle extensions. In other words, an extension payload looks exactly like an event payload. They're processed exactly the same way. The downside to that is confusion over which one is the actual event that matters. I also was thinking about this, saying you could have a utility profile, and the example from the risk group is, do you define a top-level claim like the subject's claim, which has some complex substructure to define things like email users versus OpenID Connect users versus telephone number users? Or do you create a profile that would be a utility class that holds those claims? You could construct it either way. One of the other features that many people have had from the beginning is the ability to develop specs on the fly, which is why we chose event types as expressed as URIs rather than URNs. And a lot of people said, okay, I might take a skim event or a risk event, but I might want to add more data because the partner I'm sharing events with is really part of my administrative domain, and we're going to share more data. I can't see a reason why not to, and that seems reasonable. I'll have an example of that later. We also thought that there was a concern that if you're conveying multiple pieces of information expressed across multiple sets, then the expense of checking n signatures is more expensive than just one signature of a larger object. So that was one comment put forward. That's basically it for that.
When you say previous consensus on this, Phil, this is, what does that mean?
This was the view as of when 03 was published. That's since changed. So as an example, I looked at, there's an event from the old skim profile draft where there's a password reset function, and we described an extension to that as a hypothetical extension where you say, might also be useful if some providers want to tell their receivers the number of password resets that have occurred and add a counter to that. So go to the next slide. This is a build. So this just sort of describes an event where the extension is really doesn't stand on its own. It has to be shipped with the primary event, the password reset. But if we look at the perspective of another community, the risk community, they have some overlap, and they have an event that covers this, but in a broader sense. And go to the next slide. So the risk account credential change require somewhat overlaps in the sense that that change might boil down to a password reset, or it might be something else. It's a broader context event. One of the differentiators is that risk tends to come from a security calculation, whereas the skim event is often triggered in the normal course of business. The user asked for an account reset, and that's what happened, whereas in risk generally, but not always, it's the feeling is some security system performed some calculation and came to the conclusion that an account credential change is required. So if we go to the next slide, the question then is, if I send these all together in one set, the scenario could describe that the event was triggered by the security system, and that security system, as part of that same transaction, has caused a skim system to do a password reset as part of that. Or another interpretation is that there's account change required because there's been 5 resets. It depends on the relationship and what the sequence of events, but this becomes possible to express. There's an optionality concern that some systems are risk only, some systems are skim only, and some simply just don't care about the others. We've talked that a stream might send both, and if that's possible, that's useful. But the concern is if I convey these as 3 separate events, there's no signaling to tell a receiver that there's more information coming about this same transaction. So if I don't know that it's coming, the only way I could check for that would be to wait a long period of time. So next slide. So this was just an example of looking at the JSON, and it's one simpler than the other. I'll just go to the slide and point it out for those who are not there, so I'm going to leave the box for a moment.
Just take the whole thing.
Push it up. Okay, so on the left, in the current proposal, we have events, and the format is that under events, the next object is an event URI attribute, and then this JSON object is what we've been referring to as the payload. The second payload is here, which is the skim or the risk event, and its payload below that says, here's what's going on. And then the skim password reset is complete here. The extension to skim that says the reset attempts are there. So these are processed in JSON parsing terms at the same time. So you end up with a hash of 3 events, each with independent objects that are fairly clean. In the Comparable example, as I understand it, with the event, you would have a single event, an event type, and you'd have to choose which event you're going to express. And then if you're going to somehow send the other events, they would have to be as extensions. So if SCIM defined this, they would have to define what they allow in their extension. One thing I wonder about is, what is the format of this section? Which looks a lot now like that. And what is the format over here? You have multiple formats. That might not be the way SCIM does it. That might not be the way RISC does it. But the concern I have is there would be no standards for interop on extension mechanisms. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. Next slide. So the question is, does a single set convey the whole picture? Does having all three payloads add value versus getting them in 2 or 3 sets? Would you draw different conclusions? It's hard to say. And I think this comes about because the SCIM working group is working independently from the RISC working group, which may be also overlapped by another future working group from the Payment Card Association or some other industry association. So I kind of suggested that we have some flexibility, that when things overlap, you can convey them together to give the bigger picture, the bigger whole, and let the receiver draw the conclusion.
Phil, you just mentioned the SCIM working group.
Yes.
Is there? I don't think there is a active SCIM working group.
So the
today.
SCIM working group is closed at the moment. In its charter, it has an unresolved issue called event triggers. What actually happened was we started working on that and decided to broaden the spec, and at the SCIM working group, it was agreed to move forward on a SEC events working group as a separate working group. So at the moment, we have not resurrected the SCIM to complete the SCIM profile because the work was transferred here.
So are you saying that the SCIM profile is part of this working group's charter?
It was an input document to this working group.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that the SCIM working group versus the RISC working group is doing 2 different pieces of work, but there isn't an active SCIM working group, so that's a confusing statement.
From my perspective, this is the working group because the work was transferred here. But I do not know whether we will publish. It is unclear yet whether we will resurrect the SCIM working group to finish the SCIM profile or whether we finish that under this working group. But I would leave that to the directors in the chair.
Okay.
Next slide.
Did it go?
Still says observations.
No. It's like...
So this was just the author's recommendations. For a number of reasons, we felt that you can accomplish a single event if you want to. The optionality is there. I spoke to Annabelle just before the meeting, and the optionality does become a concern, though, for some transmitters who may not be able to send a combined event. Receivers can say, I just want a RISC events and RISC events only, or SCIM events and SCIM events only. That's already there. That's in the spec. There's nothing saying that the event can't contain a single event. The issue is, does it require a transmitter to combine events if that's what the receiver wants? And I think that's the concern. From a process perspective, my conclusion looking at it, that we would be starting with a new internet draft proposal and starting over if we want to go this way. So because of all of that, our recommendation is to leave it as is. Maybe we have some clarification on optionality. And that's it. So the next slide is discussion, and we can do some of that or do it later.
Well, we're out of time for the slot now, so we'll bring that up later. Thanks, Phil. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. You're at the mic.
Hi, Justin Richer. As progenitor of the current syntax in the document, after having heard Phil's argument for keeping the current syntax, I'm actually leaning towards Annabelle's proposed new syntax, specifically because the idea behind the current syntax was to make it easier for the receiver of the set to be able to, as Phil said, go in, I just want this one thing, I just want this one aspect of this event that I care about. It was never intended to carry multiple events in a single payload. It was meant to carry multiple aspects of a single event in a payload, and that's why it's expressed as a hash, the way that it is today. I think that we went off the rails in terms of extensions and all of this other stuff, and sort of primary versus secondary events, and all of that complexity is now leading me to believe that we really do, we would be well served to pull that back into something that is more, no, this really is a single event, and agree on common fields such as time of event and things like that in the event payload that would actually describe those events commonly across different systems.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment now? We'll bring this up again later.
Yeah, Tony Nadlin, we believe that these actually need to be together. So we have cases where we have risk event followed by skim events in the same thing, in the same payload. Right now, if we get a password, if we get a account change or something, we will also throw in the skim events into the same payload. So it just makes it easier for our engine to determine what's going on as a whole than to have these singleized events coming across the wire, and you have no way to know what the correlation action is between them.
So are you suggesting that you would force that they would all come together, Tony? Can you go to the mic again?
I'm not sure I would force, but I think if you receive them, you have to understand. So, I mean, it's going to come down to that. I mean, if we happen to bundle them all together, you would have to understand the bundle together. If you send them separately, we'll have to understand them separately.
Right. So, okay. So, while there may be advantages in being bundled, unless you always bundle them, then you'll have to deal with them being unbundled as well. Yes, Justin.
Justin, again, this is that is exactly the problem that I'm realizing that the current data structure has, and that's that if people are making giving semantic weight to multiple aspects being in the same payload and treating that differently than if they had received them separately, that I think is problematic. That was never, in our use cases, that was never the intended interpretation. And so I did not anticipate that being an interpretation when we originally put that forward. But if that's what people are doing, I think that's a bad idea, and they should be carried separately. There is some Jose overhead of multiple signatures and things like that, but I think that the clarity gained is probably worth it.
Okay. Leif?
So Leif Johansson, so there is a way to have your cake and eat it. You can just make the grouping semantic explicit and create an event group mechanism, right? And would allow people who want to do simple sort of one-off events to do that, and people who want to group them to do that, right?
I actually myself, I couldn't quite follow, and I couldn't quite understand what you're saying, Leif.
Annabelle Backman, I believe the suggestion was that an event type could be defined that is a grouping of events. So it's a single event. Within that event, there is a list of events that are all semantically tied together in some way.
Essentially you create a new Uber event. It's a meta event.
Right.
So you have one event that has three things.
It's an event bundle event.
Right.
Right, exactly.
Right. But you're understanding the meta event.
And the point of that is that you make the grouping semantic explicit instead of implicit. Right?
Okay. We're low on time. I'm going to move to the next one. Yep. Go ahead.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Marius Cortescu from Google. I'm going to give an update on the delivery spec. Changes that happened since IETF 99 and a couple of open questions. Next slide.
Okay. Hey, I'm going to have you do this. So I have to go to the bathroom.
Sure. All right. All right, so changes since IETF 99. I point to the current draft, the previous one. There were very few changes. One notable change is that the verification event definition moved to a management API. So this is a special event which allows transmitters to just verify that the line or the delivery is still alive, or allows receivers to request one of these just to make sure that the connection still works. Now moving on to open questions. So one big open question is that the spec defines two delivery methods. One is HTTP post to define a push delivery method. The other one defines a polling delivery method. And many transmitters expressed the fact that they want to implement one or the other, but not both. They are both defined in the same spec. It's not clear to us if IETF encourages, allows that, or what are the solutions in these cases. So feedback from the community would be very welcome in this case. Another thing is these delivery methods all require some attributes. I give some examples there. So for the push delivery is an endpoint and potentially an authorization header. The polling delivery method needs an endpoint, but this endpoint, its read-only is defined by the transmitter. And we are looking at formal methods where the delivery methods can define, here are the attributes needed for an implementation, and then management APIs can define ways how these are set and retrieved. Tony, I think.
Tony Nadlin. So a question comes back is, what did you mean by making polling optional? What does that mean? What does that actually?
Okay, can you go one slide back? So as a transmitter, do I have to implement both push and polling, or I can choose and implement one of them? And how do I achieve that? So that's what I mean by optional.
So either would be optional.
I know that's a requirement that many people express. I agree with that. But my question is, because the feedback we got so far is that IETF doesn't like specs which has optional components to it. Maybe that's acceptable. And if that's acceptable, it's fine. If not, then we need to find a way to achieve that.
I think it's Phil here. I think the optionality might be the wrong sense to think about this, is that it depends on what your network scenario is. If you're trying to get through a firewall that you can't otherwise get through, you don't really have there's no optionality. If you're going to send an event, polling is the only thing that's going to work. So it's more of you got to use the tool you have to use to get it done, and that's why we have two optional specs. So I think the question, the better way to phrase it is there any value in having one of them mandatory to implement? That's really the better way to phrase it in IETF terms.
Sure.
Annabelle Backman. So I think the concern I see there is if an implementer says, I support set delivery over HTTP, what does that mean? If I'm trying to interop with them, what does that mean to me? If both are optional, then that on its own doesn't really tell me anything. I need to know, okay, which within set delivery over HTTP, what did you actually implement? Did you actually implement polling, or did you implement push, or both? So having that kind of variability in the spec itself, I think weakens the utility of the spec as a interop tool.
Mm-hmm.
Did you propose that these be separate specs?
I didn't propose anything. I just brought this up as a potential
Okay.
issue. Yeah. we
I
can
think
talk about
the-
possible solutions. But yeah.
I think the concern is that the client, the receiver, doesn't have a choice. He's either A or B. They either have an openly accessible API endpoint where they can receive events, or they don't. So they don't have a choice. They have a requirement that they're expressing, and then it's really up to the transmitter to say, do I want to be able to send events depending to that receiver, given they don't have a choice?
Maybe something clarifies for me. This is a framework, and so a profile would be saying what an implementer needed to do, not do. That wouldn't be in sec event that you'd have to do that. Would you? No. Okay.
Yeah.
So
That could be something that a profile would
the profile would
dictate.
decide whether.
But the profile may also say that either of these are the option are available.
Right.
Either of these will work.
It's Phil again. To clarify, I don't believe it's a profile issue, because whether it's RISC, whether it's SCIM or HART, it really depends on the network reality that's out there. It doesn't have anything specifically to do with profile, although it may be true that some profile out there doesn't have any network differences that they have to be concerned about. So they could rule one out. But in general, I think at the sec events level, it depends on what the client needs and whether you want to support that client.
Annabelle Backman. It's true that the network situation that the receiver has is kind of a limiting factor for them. That doesn't change the fact that having one or both of these as optional in the spec introduces ambiguity for them as far as understanding what's available to them. If you are a receiver who cannot expose endpoints such that a polling is a requirement for you, then again, seeing a transmitter describe themselves as supporting set delivery over HTTP still doesn't tell you, can I interrupt with this person? Do I need to try to get them to implement polling, or do I need to find a third-party service I can use as a proxy? You still have to go to some other resource to find out what they actually mean when they say they're implementing that spec.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think we can move past the attributes. And here is an example of how attributes would be used, for example, in an API which allows you to query the state of an existing stream. I highlighted in bold, for example, the deliver method URI, a URL parameter, which is the endpoint where events are pushed or posted through post, and an example authorization header, just to have a visual example of what these attributes mean. And since I mentioned HTTP authorization header for the push method, we proposed several authorization mechanisms, but we are proposing a very specific one. The main requirement for this one comes from preventing denial of service attacks. And basically this proposal is to allow receivers to specify the full HTTP authorization header, and it's up to the receiver. For example, it can define basic auth or an API key or even an access token. If it's longer lived, then they can refresh it periodically.
So what's the question here as to whether it should be in the spec as to how to authenticate?
Yes, and if it's a good idea to have a general configuration like this.
Tony Nadlin, are you saying that the authorization header is can only be used in the push?
No, I'm just saying that the proposal is to allow for push for receivers to to set the header. It has uses in many other cases, but the proposal is strictly for that delivery method.
So what were you implying? I think what you're saying, Tony, is that do we spec both push and pull, and do we spec how we authorize within sec event, or do we leave that to the profiles?
I don't have the answer right now, but
that's the question. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
And
yep.
I think if you leave it to the profiles, then we really are going down the path where you can only send one event, and you're going to have multiple streams working on different protocol capabilities, because each profile is defining different configuration, and we throw away interop at that level.
Justin Richer, at that point, one has to ask the question of, if everything is going in profiles, what are we doing here?
Right. So I'm not saying it should be done at the profile level. This proposal that is for.
You're making an open question.
Yeah, you're
And the
making an open
is
question, and this is
Sure.
my response to that question. If that is what I keep hearing, the refrain of, "Oh, that's in a profile. Oh, that's in a profile. Oh, that's in a profile," and it really makes me wonder what's left in a security event. So when we first came together to talk about security events, a lot of you already know this. It was fairly simple concept in that you put a bunch of stuff in the envelope that says this is what this is kind of about the sender of the event and where it's going and whatnot. And then there was a payload that was going to have a bunch of common fields to every event, but because it's JSON and therefore schema by fiat, a bunch of other stuff in there too. That bunch of other stuff could be profiled. We've gone a long way from there now. And I am really afraid that this mantra of, oh, we will make a profile that specifies, how we authorize the push call or something like that, how we do time of event, how we do subject, how we do anything, is leaving precious little for the set to actually define, because it's kind of stripping it down and saying it's just a jot. And so if you have a bunch of independent working groups that all agree to just use jots, why do they care?
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Sure.
I mean, that's a core part of what I'm going to drive as a conversation later. In the interest of time, let's move to your next presentation, Marius.
All right. So me again. So I'm going to present an event stream management API. We're going to talk about two management APIs today. This one it's a simple one, REST inspired, not necessarily a REST API, but it's a simple API with small consumer clients in mind. So we had a proposal for this one at IETF 99. We presented it. It's an individual draft. I will present the API at a glance, because we are going to compare it to another proposal and then go to some future work and open questions. So I'm pointing to the two drafts, the current one and previous one. The main changes since IETF 99, we added the stream configuration update operation. We split out a stream status operation. The verification event definition was moved from the delivery spec into this one. And then a security considerations sections was added. All right, so now we're going to look at the API. I'm going to probably go quickly through these slides, and you let me know if we need to stop anywhere. But so get stream config, this is the request. So it's just a get to an endpoint. And then you get back a JSON blob, which describes how that stream is configured. And you can see here, there is the audience, obviously, and then there is a delivery method, and these are the events supported by that given receiver. And then some possible errors. Interesting one here, it's 404. That means a stream has not been configured for this receiver, for example. Update the stream config. This is a post back to the same endpoint with a JSON blob to update some of those fields. Stream status. This is a lightweight API. It just gets back a status telling that is the stream enabled, paused, is in fail mode, or in what mode that is. And it's meant for monitoring or alert systems. Okay, now, yeah.
So on that set, would you use that same pattern to modify other attributes, or is that another separate command?
Yes, this could have an update as well to force the status to a given one.
Well, I mean, if you want to change another field like authorization header, is that a different operation?
Yes, that would be a different one.
Okay,
Yes.
thanks.
Yep. All right. So there are two add, remove subject, two operations to add and remove subjects. I'm going to show request, response, error codes, and then another request. The idea is for an implicit receiver to be able to manage the list of subjects or the set of subjects they are interested in events. There is an example here of adding a subject based on an email address. Again, the exact way the subjects are identified, it's expected to be done in a profile. Email here and the phone number below are just pure examples. But basically, it's a post to an endpoint and then some way to identify which subject needs to be added. Next. And then possible errors.
Just wondering for the other profiles, does this command even make sense? Justin, for Hart, do you need something to say, hey, I'm interested in getting information? I don't think it makes sense in OIDC or OAuth because those have implicit flows.
Yeah, I don't think it really makes that much sense either. So we had toyed around with the idea of a what we were calling the shoebox endpoint. So in most of the Hart use cases, think of these event token things as being receipts for something happening during a transaction, right? So I give my doctor accesses things. Those are discrete events, things happen, and I want some record of those things happening.
So the subject was implicit in some other flow as opposed to having to be explicitly made.
Exactly. So I don't think it really made sense for that to be
Right.
called out in the same way.
Phil, it's behind you. Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, on the skim side, it is possible we might use this, particularly when skim is used in the consumer environment. In the enterprise environment, you tend to be put into a group, and the group defines whether whether events are going to be sent for that person on the basis of the group, or there's some filter on an entitlement attribute that says we're sharing data about you with Salesforce because you're configured to have a Salesforce CRM account, and it's all set up. So we don't have the need through the control plane to manage it necessarily, but I wouldn't rule out this as a useful thing either.
I'll answer your question as well. So for the remove subject, maybe move on to the next one. One more. Okay. So for the remove, there might be a use case even in the OIDC use case, right? When the user actually wants to opt out and tells explicitly a receiver, no, do not send or do not process risk events on my behalf. And there might be a use case there where an explicit call like this might still be necessary. It's not clear yet. So.
Okay.
So this is the corresponding remove, very similar to add.
Also, Annabelle Backman, also for OpenID Connect scenarios, if the end user severs the relationship on the RP side, so instead of using the IDP to sign in, they're going to have a local password, then the RP may want to, at that point, unenroll in events for that subject.
Yeah, normally the RP would revoke the token, whatever tokens they have, grants they have, right? Which would achieve the same thing, but maybe.
Yeah, I'm not sure those are semantically equivalent.
All right. The verification event was moved here from the distribution draft. So this is an example of how a verification event looks like. Pretty straightforward. There is an event URI and there is an optional state parameter attribute. Next.
What does the state parameter represent?
You'll see on the next slide. So there is a way for a receiver to request a verification event. So they just post to a specific endpoint, and they can specify a state parameter which should be echoed back in the event when they receive it, so they can correlate with that.
Not a good question.
It was a good question. All right. Some future work. To allow receivers to specify supported events and to allow transmitters to declare the supported events by them. So basically a transmitter can say, I support these 5 events. The receiver say, I'm interested in these 5, but only 3 of them overlap. And then on the actual stream, potentially only those 3 events would be flowing. So this is a privacy feature and allowing receivers to be extremely explicit about what events they want to receive. Next. And this is an example. It may not have to be this elaborate, but basically in a stream configuration, you could have a list of events that are requested by the receiver, the ones supported by the transmitter, and at the bottom, what actually might flow on that stream. We need to future work to maybe to add more clarification of how subjects are defined in profiles, and to define maybe some attributes which define a subject schema, and so forth. We're going to see some examples in a future, in a bit later, when Annabelle is going to present how this is done in RISC. Next. All right. One thing we need to clarify is how to distinguish between read-only and read-write configuration parameters. When we get the configuration of a stream using an HTTP GET, we get a JSON blob. Some of them are read-only, some of them are read-write. When we post back to the same endpoint to change some, there is space for confusion here, and it's not clear how we should deal with that. Next. And also there is we keep talking about the discovery document. It's not clear if this management API is the right place for a discovery document. The current proposed brainstorming is to have something very similar to a discovery document done in OpenID Connect, very similar, well-known. And here is a JSON blob describing such a potential discovery document for SEC events. Describes the issuer, the endpoints. It could describe some other, what capabilities, for example, what delivery methods are supported, and we can imagine other attributes there. Next. All right, thank you.
Annabelle's up, I think. Yes. Huh? It's after you.
Hi, so I'm Annabelle Backman. I'm going to be presenting how we are profiling what Marius just talked about in the risk working group, where we're at with that. So we've had a lot of talk about this will go to the profile, that'll go to the profile. Let's walk through an example of what that might look like. So just to get everyone on the same kind of baseline, the use cases that risk has for a management API are these 5 here. For what we call in risk implicit relying parties, these are parties such as Amazon, where we do not directly depend, we don't have an OpenID Connect relationship with Google, but we have a lot of customers who use their Gmail account as their forgot password mechanism. So we sort of implicitly depend on the security of that Gmail account. For RPs like us, we need a way to explicitly enroll and say, hey, we need events about this this account because they've started using our system. Similarly, I think unenrolling events, we talked through a little bit about that, about the use cases for that just a moment ago, so you heard that. Those apply to risk. As Marius showed, there's a need for receivers to specify what kind of events they can receive or they want to receive from a transmitter. So we need a mechanism for that. We need a mechanism to say how we're going to receive these events, what endpoints, and then we want to have a mechanism to make sure that a particular stream is active and functional. There are no issues with receiving events over it. Right? So one of the things we talked about earlier was authorization and the need to figure out how to profile that. Well, there's also the question of how do we authorize the management API. So what we've said in risk is the management API will use the HTTP authorization header and we'll use bearer tokens. The presumption in the conversations that we've had between people involved is these are probably using client credentials grant. These are tokens that are issued really between service to service. There's not a customer or user identity involved here, but they are bearer tokens. So there's three main types of subjects that we have talked about in risk. Marius mentioned the need to be able to define different subject types. So this is what we're looking at in risk right now. There's subjects that are primarily identified by email address, subjects identified by a phone number, and then subjects identified through an issuer and subject pair, as you would see in an OpenID Connect relationship. We've defined a structure here that there's a consistent way for us to represent this set of fields collectively identifies a subject, and we have a type in there to specify this is the schema for this particular subject.
So I just want to point out to everybody that this is quite different than some of the other profiles that are viewing that they can have a simple string identifying the subject, that this is really an object identifying the subject.
Yeah, one of the issues we have with what's specified at the JOT level and the discussion around sets and the use of the sub claim is our subjects don't just follow that format necessarily. So we need to have some more complex way to identify that. And this is just an example of what one of these, how we would use one of these subjects in a set. We've defined a risk subject claim at the top level of the set, and within that, the value of that is one of these objects that we just saw on the other slide. So just a few examples of these showing the only thing about those sets that changes is that risk subject content. And then here's what that would look like on an add. This is an add request. A remove request would look very similar. The other last thing I want to talk about here is discovery and what we're looking at the risk level for that. There's a lot of things that we could think of when we talk about discovery. Just to be clear, the first thing that might come to mind is the event stream capabilities. What types are supported, what delivery methods are available. We're not talking about that here. Next. Yeah, we're not talking about that here. What we're interested in are this other point, this question of how are we discovering the management API? And secondly, how are we discovering who to talk to in the first place, given an identifier? Earlier I talked about Amazon wanting to receive events about a Gmail account. Well, that's pretty easy because a Gmail account is Gmail. Everybody knows it's Google who runs that. But there are a whole lot of other email addresses out there. And then there's things like phone numbers where it's completely unclear, given the phone number, who's authoritative for that or not. So we need mechanisms to identify that for different identifier types. Next slide. Yeah. So something we've discussed is having specific discovery mechanisms for each subject type that we define. There are some mechanisms out there already. OpenID Connect gives us, OpenID Connect Discovery that, is a discovery mechanism off issuer and subject. It also talks about doing that discovery off of email address. There are some further proposals in that space around other ways to do that discovery. Mobile, the OpenID Mobile Connect group also has some pieces in place for discovering from phone number as well. Go ahead.
Kathleen Moriarty, Area Director. Are you thinking about the privacy concerns, and have you looked at RFC 6973 for some guidance on that? Do you need help in this space?
I think privacy concerns are definitely something that the working group has spent a lot of time talking about. That's one of the big concerns, is how do we get users the benefit of this information sharing without creeping them out, because we don't want to do that. I'm not familiar with the RFC you specified, but if you have input you want to provide, would definitely be interested to hear it. I'd be happy to talk to you about that after the session, since it's more risk oriented.
Yeah, and I have not read the draft, so
Sure.
but I'm happy to help, of course.
Just
Yeah.
to clarify, Kathleen, this is in risk, which is an OIDF. This is the risk right? Yeah.
Yes.
Annabelle's going through how risk would use this to go and help understand the spec that
Right.
Mary has put together.
Yeah, this is giving context to all of these things that we're saying, oh, profiles will do it, profiles will do it. Well, what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? This is an example of that. Nevertheless, I'd be happy to, I'd love to talk to you afterwards if there's information or guidance that IETF has learned about this area that maybe we could take and use over there. That'd be great to hear.
Yeah, so the use of identifiers in particular is a really tough one, right? Because you can identify people and you can trace it to activities, and that could be quite revealing, and it could be harmful.
Right.
in
One of the
so many ways.
Yeah. One of the challenges we have in risk is how do we communicate enough information that we have a meaningful signal while not over communicating, and that's something we've had to be very, very cautious of in how we define events and what gets put in those events and what
Okay.
those events get packaged alongside.
So what I'll also, I'd recommend looking at the HRPC draft that is in the the RFC editor queue as well, to learn about, what they're recommending for, protecting anonymity for human rights. If you live in the wrong country,
Right.
and you can get traced back to doing some simple things that we take for granted, it could mean your life, right? So identifiers tied to people is something that we've been very sensitive to in IESG last call reviews.
Right. One of the other things we discussed, I didn't show it here because the use case isn't that strong, was communicating via hashes of identifiers rather than the identifier itself. That'd be particularly valuable in scenarios where the two parties, maybe there's less clarity over whether or not this user is already using that identifier with that other party. So communicating using hashes will give you some of that capability. Thank you.
It's Phil. I was going to say that as well. And I think in a lot of the other cases where they're sharing the identifier, it's usually done on the basis that it was already shared previously, in the case of OpenID Connect, through the ID token. So risk may be sharing PII, but it's data that's previously been shared. So it's not exposing new information. But we actually, I think, in most cases are trying to figure out still, can we actually share less information than was originally disclosed, because the security system might not have been part of that original federation.
Thank you. I think we can go to the next. Yeah. If there's any questions about this, again, this is very OpenID risk specific, so happy to talk to people outside of the SecEvents context as well if you want to hear more about that.
This is Justin. Just a quick syntactic question, because this is a profile. Why are you mucking around up in the root of the JOT instead of putting the risk subject down inside the event object itself? Is there a reason for that?
Why does it need to be in the event subject or in the event body?
Because it's part of the event,
So is sub.
which is why we shouldn't be using that sub up there. I've made that point the whole time. I think that's a dumb idea too. So the sub that's in the root is the subject, from the view of the issuer of the event, not necessarily of the event itself, which is why any subject to the event should be in the event object.
Yeah, generally within risk, that's the same thing. The subject from the perspective of the transmitter and receiver, they're identified the same way. Otherwise, you don't have a functional system. So that's the way we've approached it. But if that's contrary to what is being mandated by the set spec, then there isn't really a problem for risk to move that down into the event body itself.
Okay.
I think right now the set spec does not make that clear, though.
Okay. That is something that I would encourage the editors of the set spec to clarify then, if that is in fact the direction the working group
Yeah,
wants
I
to
believe
take
there's
it.
nothing in the set draft currently that says that events or profiles should not add content to the root level of the job, which seems to be what you're suggesting. Is that
Right,
right?
yeah. Just for data cleanliness, if nothing else, it
Mhm.
would make more sense, if you ask me, for profiles to stay in the event object and for set to define the envelope and common elements in the event object itself.
Yeah.
I-
So you do bring up there's a challenge here given and
Yeah.
why some of our discussion around set is there. If it's inside of the event, given the current structure, you can't have any other top level property at the top level because all the top level properties are the different URIs inside of events.
Mhm.
And then if you put it inside of that object, and if you have multiple things, then how do you know they're about the same? You're redundant on the subject. So if you're trying to say that all these are about the same subject, well, then where does the subject go? It can't be inside of the event object itself. Well, because it has to be
Oh, it has to
inside
be
of the
inside the sub-object.
it has to be
given
inside of
current
the
site.
URI,
Yeah.
which means that you're duplicating the subject
Yeah.
potentially in every URI.
Yeah.
And so then you potentially drive it up to be above the event, right?
With that
That's
duplicated,
solving a problem we don't have yet, which is to say sets getting too big with an optimization that makes the data.
it's
Well-
not just a size problem, it's also a semantic problem. You introduced the possibility of different events actually within the same set actually identifying totally separate subjects. And what the hell does that mean?
Which I think is another argument for Annabelle's change of syntax.
Yes.
I agree.
Yeah. Her example was in the flavor of the current set spec and highlights some of the challenges of the current set spec. Yes, Phil?
I think if we have another mysterious draft comes from somewhere else, they may be talking about the same entity. That would be implied, even though they have different subject terminology for them. So, for example, SCIM uses URIs for resources, yet they may still have a connect subject and an email. So there's 3 different ways to talk about the same subject. And so it might be reasonable to have, in payment card industries using credit card numbers. So it might be reasonable that the payment card payload contains the credit card number, the connect payload contains that, and so on. And they're all tied together. Because they're tied together, one can infer, and maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing, that these are all things related about the same thing.
The problem.
So I just want to jump. So to pick up on Kathleen's point around privacy, right? With multiple events all tied together, we're now creating a bunch of correlated identifiers on the same user and saying that this is all the same user, where if you had different events, you wouldn't know that they're necessarily correlated unless you already have that correlated data.
Correct, but RISC is already talking about doing that within its own domain. And if you're already deciding to share a payment card event and a RISC event, then by concealing it, are you actually creating privacy or not? I don't know.
Yes. Well, you're not creating it, but you're maintaining it. There's no guarantee that the other party, the recipient of that, knows that that credit card number or that credit card information and that subject go hand in hand, that email
I
address.
guess, playing devil's advocate, I was thinking about if you send them separately, then the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And I'm not sure that that's always a good thing. When the left hand and the right hand have to communicate at the same time, then it's clear what you're communicating as an organization.
When they have to communicate, then the receivers that need to do that can build systems to do that. But if the format requires or mandates that the information gets correlated, then the receivers who don't want it correlated, their hands are tied. They don't have a path forward for that. The other thing I wanted to bring up about putting subject in the
Before
event body, if
before
I
you go
could
on-
please,
Before you go on to the
Okay.
next thought. So I don't think there's a problem if the receiver doesn't care about the other data, they wouldn't have configured for it. So if they don't want the payment
There's
card
a
industry
privacy
data,
issue there if the receiver gets data that they're not aware of. Now they
right?
have,
So nobody's saying that they should get data they didn't ask for. So if they say I just want risk data, then they just
right,
get risk data.
as long as there's a mechanism by which a receiver can receive those events separately, then that is true. I'm just saying that requirement exists.
Well, not just separately, so they don't have to receive it at all. You know, if I just want risk events, then I should be able to get just risk events.
Right. What I'm
Yeah,
saying
sure,
is
but
that
you could envision the other way where a malicious receiver says they want a whole bunch of stuff and now they're getting a bunch of things that are correlated that they didn't know.
True, that's up for the
Yeah.
business sharing agreement to sort out. I don't think it's a protocol issue.
We're 8 minutes behind. If we could.
Yep. Now I'll leave it to Phil.
I had the slides up earlier.
Okay.
Let's move along.
So first I thought I'd address the question why SCIM, when I looked at the requirements, it looked awfully familiar. SCIM is a provisioning protocol. It was meant to provision users and security subjects. It's actually been used quite widely and extended to Internet of Things, provisioning applications, lots of other areas. SCIM is a RESTful design that defines a resource lifecycle. And one of its key points is maintaining referential integrity. So as things change over time, you don't lose your references to objects if you were trying to remember them. This was a problem with other protocols such as LDAP, another thing that we were quite concerned about. Some of those features seem useful here. It has some good implementation and open source availability. If you want to look for a list of those, you can go to simplecloud.info. There are a list of SCIM 1 and SCIM 2 implementations, and I recently checked, and there are over 20 SCIM 2 libraries available now. Yeah, go to the next slide. So it's widely used. I'll leave that for later. We have the same design requirements. Let's go on. So these examples I'm going to give you cover off both risk and SCIM. In fact, they're mostly risk. One of the key differences is that SCIM uses the HTTP methods in the RESTful sense to create the operations to create, search, replace, modify, and remove a resource. So one of the fundamental differences that Marius was showing you was that when you, for example, want to remove a subject, it's more like you're passing a parameter saying this is the subject I want to remove. In SCIM, you have to know the resource of that subject to pull it. So that's a bit of a trade-off, but there are some advantages where the receiver can keep track of the subjects it's registered and delete them on request if it wants to. SCIM uses JSON documents as the resources. The structure of those documents is defined by RFC 7643. It already has things defined like attribute types, mutability. Marius was talking about is a configuration attribute read-only, or is it updatable? Is it write-only? Things like that. SCIM defines how you handle composites. The example Annabelle gave about subjects being either a connect user or an email address, that's something familiar to SCIM. It also deals with attributes that may be visible or not visible. In other words, I can enroll a subject, but I can't necessarily see all the subjects that are enrolled. That's something that SCIM deals with. You can also have attribute values canonicalized so that you can say, these are the valid values for this attribute. It also has an extension mechanism. So if I was defining an event stream, I could use that extension mechanism to define and a place to put configuration parameters for each delivery method that gets defined over time. So let's go to the next slide. In order to figure out what things are available in a server, what event streams are there, There is discovery to find out where's the container for event streams. It tells me what the primary schema is for that. And then I can go to the schema endpoint and it will tell me all the attributes that are part of an event stream, what their mutability and readability are, and things like that.
These are standard SCIM endpoints?
Yeah, these are standard SCIM features that you already have.
Are these standard SCIM endpoints?
Yes.
Schemas, resource types, okay.
Yeah. Service provider config really just says, tells you what features are available at that SCIM endpoint. In SCIM, certain methods are optional to implement. This is how you find that out. Next slide. So, like Marius showed, we have defined error conditioning handles. So rather than get into that, I will say one point. In the processing rules, we worked hard not to throw errors. The issue is, if you understand what the client wants to be done, you don't necessarily have to throw the error. So if the client makes a mistake by trying to update an attribute that's read-only, if you feel that you understand what's going on, you can accept that and not throw an error. This gets around complex problems where a client seems to think a parameter is writable, but it's not. The real reason for it was we wanted to be able to do a get, make a quick change, and then I just want to throw the object back with a put. We didn't want to have that be complex. So next slide.
That reminds me of the early days of the web or browsers where bozo correcting us to, people that coded it wrong and it figured out and guessed what you wanted. Is that the idea?
Kind of, yeah. So the create is just a post to the event streams endpoint. This is for saying that I'm creating an event stream, and I'm also creating an extension called web callback. The parameters, these would be the standard parameters that we would define in the SecEvent spec for configuration. And then down here, we could put method-specific configuration parameters. Since this was a late add, I didn't actually give a full example of a delivery method-specific parameters, but this is how it would look under SCIM. Next slide. So in response to that, you get an object created. It gets a permanent resource identifier, some long GUID basically. That number is the same here. As Mary has shown, we have the event URIs that were requested, the event URIs that are available that the service provider supports, and these are the event URIs that are configured. You'll notice the square brackets, which tells you that's an array. I just didn't have multiple examples for this one.
So when you create an event stream, you're going to get back the identifier, which is the full URL, and then you'll have to use that for future operations.
You can, or you can search for it if you didn't keep track of it. So you can do a get with a filter to say, give me my event streams, and it would give you that back. So you can go at it either way. So the example there, if I want to get it, if I remember that URL, I just do a get. I can also do it as a filtered query. And I just want to check, I just want to return the status if it's not equal to on. If it's another condition, I want to see the error condition and what happened, return it if there is an error. So in this example, we got the response back. The status wasn't equal to OK. It's now fail. And there's a couple of attributes here to signal what the error condition was that's preventing the event delivery. Oh, back one slide. You may notice that there's this block here, which is metadata. In SCIM, anytime you see that, that's really stuff that says when was the record last modified or last updated, that kind of stuff. That's what I mean by SCIM meta attributes. So this is something that was difficult to decide on when the SCIM group was doing it. It wasn't initially liked. We liked put better, but over time this has become the favorite method for updating any resource. And the idea is you say, I want to replace an attribute. The attribute I want to replace is status, and its new value is paused.
So this is the equivalent of Marius's pausing on the status.
I could similarly just do a put, and having previously got the configuration of the event stream, I could change the value of status and just put it back. That's the other way to do it. Skim doesn't care. It can work either way. So now we're into the risk part of the presentation. In the Skim case, we tend to use groups, we tend to use filters, because the user objects are actually part of the Skim server. So in the event stream configuration in the draft, you'll see there's a bunch of ways to configure that in the event stream configuration, but I'll give you a few examples of how a profile such as risk could handle the use case like subject management. Other profiles could use Skim in a different way. What we're trying to show here is the extensibility that Skim has built into it to do it in different ways.
So just to clarify, Phil, you're saying that each profile would need a profile how to use Skim for...
Yeah, what essentially what your profile is defining is a data model. How do you want to represent the contents of your stream, right? So in this case, risk defines the contents as a set of subjects.
Okay, and so the deck here is this is some ideas around what risk would specify. That you're not proposing this would be part of sec event.
No, it's already there as part of Skim. So it's not new work, it's just there already, you get it free. So in the post...
So that's super confusing. Okay, we're specifying something, but you're saying it's already there and we get it for free.
There's no work to do this. This work is already defined by RFC 76, 43, and 44.
So why are we specifying anything then, if it's already there?
This part is not in the draft. I'm showing you how it's there as an example in the draft. It's not normative text. It's how risk could choose to model it.
Which would be a spec for how risk adds subjects.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, but the spec is of the nature of a data model, it's not defining a protocol. It's an easier thing.
Specification.
Sure.
Okay.
So this model's somewhat similar to Maris and Annabelle's presentation, where we do a post to an endpoint, and I provide the email, the stream ID, and this, because it's Skim, you have to say what is the object that you're sending. So that's there. I would just specify that, in response, it would say, great, I've created that. So this subject enrollment in that stream becomes a permanent object that can be referenced. You can update that, you can delete it. So if you want to change the email, that user changes the email, you can go back and update it and change the email.
Why would the stream ID not be in the URL per your other examples on the post?
It could be.
Oh.
I just decided to put it as a top-level object. You could also say stream IDs is plural, so I can enroll a single subject in multiple streams if that's what I wanted to do.
Next.
To delete the subject, you would just do an HTTP delete on that resource identifier. The downside is you have to know what that identifier, that path is. If you don't know it, you can query for it using a get and get that identifier.
So in this, there's a new identifier that everybody needs to track as to what's the identifier you have for the user we dealt with.
This is it's simpler from the standpoint of the HTTP operation is simple. Because of the lifecycle issue, you end up having to create a permanent resource identifier. So it's one of the downsides to this particular model. But I wanted to show it because it runs in parallel to Marius and Annabelle's design. Next slide. So So
I'm just looking at your subjects here. At the top, subjects as resource, post variant, subjects as resource, just says variant. What?
This is all I'm trying to do here is show you how you query for the subjects. We're still talking about the subject's object. How do I query and say, what is this example user part of this stream? So there's how you would express that filter and get that back. And a similar thing where issuer is gmail.com and the subject equals independent ID, expressed a different way. Next slide. So one of the other possibility that's in the spec is you could make this subjects an actual attribute of the stream configuration. So subjects would be a multi-valued attribute that has a series of sub-attributes so that I could specify email-based users, OpenID-based users, SAML phone numbers, and so forth. It's a simpler data model, but it does mean you have to use JSON patch to update it. Next slide. So if I want to check that a particular subject is part of a stream, I can ask this the query, and that tells us there's no match. If there's no match, I get total results equals 0. If I go to the next slide, and I can get a match, it says there is one match, and the ID of the stream that matches is here. The reason I'm only getting ID is that I only wanted the attribute ID returned. So I don't have to eat the whole elephant. I can just ask for the stream ID and get that. Next slide. So this is an example of how I would confirm that an OpenID Connect subject is part of a stream. What the complication that OpenID Connect presents is that it's a two-part subject. You have to have both issuer and subject. And in a database, you can end up with inner or outer join problems. So the way Skim resolves this is by saying subjects is the parent attribute, and I want to do a filter against on the same record. If value equals this and issuer equals this, then I'll get the correct intersection on the correct value of subjects. Will work. So that avoids nasty inner outer join problems. So that seems complex, but it's not because the protocol is complex, it's because the problem is. So on the event stream then, the subject's attribute has a value attribute. It has a type attribute. The type tells you what the current content of the subject is. Is it an email address? Is it an OpenID Connect? And if it's OpenID Connect, we also have the issue attribute. Is that clear?
How much more have we got?
Just a couple more. So if I want to add a subject, alice@example.com, to the stream configuration, I'm updating the subject's attribute, and the value has got two sub-attributes, type and value, and that's how you add somebody to a stream. And this is the same example done for OpenID Connect. So the type is OpenID Connect. So the value, this is an OpenID Connect subject value, and the issuer gives me complete information.
So wouldn't OpenID Connect be implicit? Like you wouldn't, am I confused there? OpenID Connect would be implicit. You wouldn't be explicitly adding an OpenID Connect identifier, would you? You'd be,
You might, I think we discussed, you might have to remove it.
right, which
Right.
this is
So-
an add example.
So this is an add example, but there's also a remove operation, so it would work the same way.
Here's the remove.
Right. So the advantage that I like about this is that I'm just specifying a filter to say this is the subject I want. I don't have to query for that ugly event subject resource identifier that in the other model. In this model, I can just say, just remove this row that matches this. So I've rushed through that, so hopefully we get some time back.
Annabelle Backman, how much of what you just presented from the SCIM protocol is mandatory to implement?
Which are you referring to?
I'm referring to all of the examples of the SCIM protocol.
I don't think that there is a fixed proposal here. Correct me if I'm wrong, Phil. You sort of propose here's a couple different ways of
For
supporting
subject management, there's
subject
probably an infinite ways it could be modeled. So
Right, but we saw
You-
several examples of capabilities of SCIM,
Right.
things like the filtering and querying. How much of what we saw there capability-wise is mandatory to implement?
you have to do the object creation and put and get have to be implemented.
You don't have to implement patch.
You do not have to implement patch.
What about the schemas and other standard endpoints that you talked about earlier?
That has to be implemented, but that also has you still have the requirement that Marius discussed, that you have to find a way to figure out what configuration parameters are required and optional, and are the parameters read write or read only.
Right, the endpoints that you presented.
I mean, this
in
one's
Skim
a
are
patch
required.
here.
The endpoints I presented, you mean for resource types and schemas?
Right. And the meta attributes.
Yeah, that's just how Skim expresses it and how discovery of configuration is done.
Mhm.
So when you have a new transmission method comes along, you would be able to find out if that service provider supports. We talked about polling just a few minutes ago. If you want to know, does Amazon support polling, I could check the schemas thing to see if you have that defined.
The point is that
you allow it,
if
but
Skim were to be used for the management API, that
Yeah.
you'd have to be using Skim's discovery mechanisms and
Yeah.
schema management mechanisms and everything. Okay.
Hi, Ali Karimi. I see that your distribution is similar to the blockchain. Do you see what is the difference between your distributions as far as the endpoints? To what is the difference between yours and blockchain? I mean, I see that it's similar.
and blockchain,
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I mean, when you go in and you identify who are your integrals are, that's the same way of the blockchain is distribute the connectivities and authorizations.
It's possible. If it is, it's a happy coincidence. I'm not aware. That's news to me.
I mean, we had this similar, I mean, this type of discussions on
Skim-
the,
Skim's origin started as an informal spec under Skim 1 that Salesforce started with Ping and a few other companies, and it was formalized a few years later as Skim 2. So that's where it came from. So, and as I recall, that would have predated blockchain by a long time. So it's possible it's just a coincidence, or possible they took some of the model from Skim.
Oh.
We struggled.
I don't want it redundant as far as
Yeah.
the two RFCs coming up.
Well,
Same thing.
the Skim is one of the perspectives here. You make a good point, because one of the perspectives when we were starting SEC events, and Yaren's brought it up over and over, is why don't you use an existing protocol for managing the stuff like netcomp? My answer was, we are reusing a protocol. It's called Skim, because many of us are also Skim users as well. But netcomp, to the people who are interested, would be brand new to everyone. It's not saying that netcomp can't work, but maybe it's the neutral spec.
Maybe we should look at both of them, and if there is a similarity, if in your paper or their paper, they should say that, hey, these are the same thing.
The problem I think comes up is that for the Skim community, any change means an additional protocol they have to support. So I'll admit it's a shortcut for the Skim community because we don't have to do anything new. We already have it. But I know there's lots of people in the room who are at risk. They're saying Skim's new to me and I have to implement that Skim stack and I don't want to. So they might be just as equally amenable to netcomp or something brand new. I thought that
If
seems to
there
be
is
the
a
issue.
rules on that already, the only thing we got to do is reference to that.
I'm
If
sorry, I
we-
can't understand what you're saying. Could you repeat that?
I said, if there is a new rules, if the scheme is new to some of the other people's, they should go back and read it. I mean, it's not your problem. If I don't know it, it's my problem.
I think that was the point I was making with the first couple of slides by saying there's
Okay, yeah.
wide adoption and lots of libraries.
Yeah, just briefly to that point, it's not necessarily our problem, but it's the problem of the people who are ultimately going to have to implement these things and play with this interop. If we want these protocols to be adopted, then they have to be, at least for risk, we need something that's going to be easy for the long tail of parties out there to implement.
And yeah, and I think it's hard to say what is easy because people are starting from different places and have different objectives. So it's tricky.
Well, it's always relative. If you've already got Skim deployed and running it, so I'm on my slides now, which you chewed in 10 minutes. You 10 minutes into my slides. So just Phil had this in the profiles before, that we have a bunch of different profiles, and as I look at a lot of the traffic on the list, Kathleen, I'm looking for some guidance here on some of what we're doing. It seems at times that sometimes we're trying to ram a square peg into a round hole on some of these things, that the requirements from different parts of the working group are radically different than other parts of the working group, and that, I wonder whether there's enough overlap for this or not. People have different problems and they should standardize on the problems. And if we try to ram too many things together, then everybody's unhappy, or one group's super unhappy, like the square peg right now in that picture.
Kathleen Moriarty, AD. So one thing that we've been working on in the ACE working group is making a list of things and comparing things. It's not an exact comparison to what you're talking about, because in their case they have, I think the word profile triggered this. They have several profiles that have to be compared to see what they want to prioritize to move forward. And there's all different requirements and use cases that would feed each of those, as well as interest in implementing and deploying, right, to understand how to prioritize and what should be worked on. And they're doing that on the wiki of the working group. Every working group has a wiki. Is there something here where you could, it could even just be a session or interim where you run through these priorities? Doesn't have to be wiki. It might not fit into that type of comparison. But if it was weighted out and shown like interest and...
Well, I've pulled together some slides that talk about what I've gathered as being some of the open issues. So I was just going to run through those just to sort of highlight what they are, just to help guide the conversation. I was sort of leading off, is there overlap as a question, and then was there going to get into the pieces.
No, and I could hear the contention through the room on different problems. So yeah, right. It didn't get lost on me.
Okay.
Yeah, before you launch into that, I'm not so sure it's a question of overlap between SCIM versus HART versus risk. What I am sensing, at least from my perspective, is the square peg round hole issue has to do with enterprise versus consumer within the risk space. So risk is doesn't have as strong as consensus at this time as maybe it should, and that's bleeding over into this working group as to trying to lay the foundation requirements that cover them all.
Yep, I think you're characterizing what some earlier discussions have been accurately, Bill. Thank you. That it doesn't seem like we have strong consensus within SECEVENT, and some of that may be the lack of strong consensus within risk. So just what some of those open issues on set, there's sort of the singularity and plurality of events. On the subject, where is the subject? How does that work? There seems to be a fair amount of contention around those. On set delivery, there's push versus pull, and then as Mary's brought in, do we specify how authentication happens, or is that left to the profile? If it's left to the profile, then you have lack of interoperability. But then could you even spec it in SECEVENT? I look at SCIM. SCIM doesn't specify how to authenticate, and so if you're using SCIM, you're probably going to use whatever mechanism's already being used in SCIM and reuse that in SECEVENT. You're not going to want to go and have SECEVENT specify how you authenticate in SCIM if you already got a way in SCIM. Stream management, for people that have deployed SCIM and are trying to use SECEVENT for skim, it's very logical and a very straightforward model to use skim to manage it. For risk, it isn't necessarily straightforward for doing a number of the risk ones, and the API that Mary has put together seems to make sense for the consumer-oriented people for solving their problem. So the question I have is there enough overlap across all of this stuff? And what are the next steps on these different things? There's contention on set event, distribution seems to be a little more aligned, but there's pull versus push. Should those be separate documents? Is that even useful enough to do those? There definitely seems to be two completely different ideas on the management API. And to Justin's earlier question, if we don't really have a lot of stuff that's common, then what are we doing here? So I sort of have these open questions that I'm posing to the working group, and welcome people to come up and provide commentary on their thoughts on this. And would love guidance from the AD on how do I drive consensus where there isn't. I don't know if it makes sense for there to be consensus for some things.
This is Justin. I would encourage all the members of the working group to concentrate on the commonalities between different profiles and specifying those, instead of waging wars over, I have my little special snowflake attribute over here that I really, really, really need to have. Okay, that's fine. Go have that. I don't care. Figure out where the overlaps are, right? Figure out what those round pegs actually are that do belong in the SECEVENT. I do think that there are quite a number of them that we could agree on. Time of event being a really simple one that seems to have bubbled up surprisingly recently. And that, I believe, is where we're going to start seeing driving consensus towards something that these multiple groups and multiple profiles and whatever can actually use. The discussions that I've seen on the list in this group so far have largely been around people arguing, no, don't specify that because I need something else, or I'm going to do something else, or I don't want you to specify that because I don't care about it. And so I think that that's just been largely destructive to the conversation so far, and the group needs to get over that.
Well, I'm not sure if that's disruptive. Those are people's opinions on what they'd like and not like.
I didn't say disruptive. I said destructive.
Oh, destructive.
Yes.
Okay. Well, almost the same thing. Kathleen, you. Sure.
Annabelle Beckman. So I definitely agree with Justin on focusing on the actual round pegs. Your description of what's been going on at the very end, though, about people saying, no, don't specify that because that doesn't work for me, or don't specify that because I need to do something different. That sounds more like a disagreement over what is a round peg and what's not. So if we haven't even gotten consensus around that, I think it's hard to focus on the round pegs if we're all seeing them differently.
Tony Nadlin. So I think, as Annabelle said, we don't know which are the round pegs and which are the square pegs. So they all look the same to me. So we just use a hammer on them, and they all work.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when you're sitting there with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Yeah. But I think that's some of the challenge in the group is some people come from one side and it all makes sense to them, and other people come from another angle and they have quite a different view on what are the right tools.
Kathleen Moriarty, how can you frame a helpful discussion to narrow down to the round pegs? And maybe this is an interim, and if it's well structured, is there a way to get to that? So that would be my first, my question to you, with a suggestion mixed into that question. What do you think?
Well,
You put me on the spot. I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I was,
No, I'm
I was,
just-
I was looking
just-
for guidance on.
No,
Almost
that's
every
fine.
one of the documents has a fair amount of contention on it, and as I've listened to the different sides, different people have valid points for what they're trying to do, because we have a number of different use cases, all trying to use the same thing, but maybe they don't really all fit, because like one's a screw and one's a nail, and you should use a screwdriver versus a hammer. Yes, I know. That's
Right. Is there some way that we can compare each of these to make it clear that there's some commonality and figure out what that commonality is? How can we have that useful conversation is kind of what I'm trying to push you towards.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we've had a bunch of offline conversations on trying to drive
How
that.
about online or interim or within a meeting?
Pardon me?
Online, not offline, right? So either, with the full group or an interim to get at some of these things, like with a focused discussion, a guided focused discussion.
Yeah, we had a intermeeting among some of the contention this morning, and I was hoping that I would see.
That's not an interim meeting. An interim meeting is announced 2 weeks in
Sure.
advance and planned, and your AD is aware of it.
So my apologies. We had an ad hoc meeting this morning,
Okay,
that I could
thank you.
so that I could try to have more consensus for the meeting here, and I was unsuccessful in that. And my takeaway out of that meeting was I didn't feel I got concerned that we were going to, whether we could get consensus on a number of these aspects in this working group.
Okay. All right. So I'm happy to help plan for an interim if that would help. I mean, do people think that it would help if we find a way to structure this to get to commonality? Would that be helpful?
I guess one of the things would
Because
be
it's not, we shouldn't do it.
an action item maybe I can take on would be to try to figure out what is everybody agreeing on and seeing if there's enough of that
Yes.
for that to be worth us working on.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm pushing towards. I just didn't know how you might do it. So
Sure. As opposed to
leaving that
focusing
open
on,
to you.
I think someone else mentioned that. Instead of focusing on where do we disagree, let's
Yeah.
highlight what we do agree on. And if there's enough that we do agree on, then that means there's something to work on. Any guidance if there isn't really an awful lot that we agree on?
I think let's revisit it, and if you could show me, work through where it is, and so I could see, then I might have more helpful guidance. Because after that first step, I guess I have to see the outcome to know if I have more helpful guidance.
Okay.
So I'm happy to work with you on this and try to find solutions. Is basically what I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you.
Annabelle Backman. I think from what I've seen on the list, most of or more of the disagreement and contention is around the kind of protocol aspects, the APIs, rather than the set token format itself. Not that hasn't been contention there, but I think it's relatively minor in comparison. It seems to me that
So if I could just interject, Phil would have a different opinion because he views that if we went with your proposal, we might as well be rewriting the whole spec. And so,
I did hear him say that. Unsurprisingly, I disagree. But the points that there's contention over, I think, arise less from pure technical incompatibility issues, whereas in the protocol space, we have one party saying, well, we have something that works and we don't want to do something else. And other parties saying, well, the option that works great for you doesn't work great for us. That's sort of more of a fundamental disagreement over requirements. Because I think at the token format level, there isn't as much of that. But if we can't close on the open issues for the token, if we can't agree on a common token format, then I don't really see there being any prayer of us making progress with anything else. So it seems like that would be the place to start.
Phil? We've got 3 minutes, guys.
I think the issue is that for many, the 03 draft has a certain wide utility that can be used in many ways. And Annabelle and yourself would like to restrict it, and now Justin would like to restrict it to one event payload and one only. So there is a lot of commonality in that we want to convey at least one event, but the problem becomes for those of us at the end of the day have to convey multiple components to that message. That just shifts the complexity somewhere else. Now we're talking about a more complex delivery protocol. A bunch of things all fall out from that, or we walk away and we don't have SEC events anymore. I still maintain that the 03 draft can be deployed and used in a single event way quite easily. And the message is clear and the message is quite simple. It only starts to look complex for these edge cases where you need to have multiple payloads, and you can't, it's an optional part and people don't have to use it. It can be used in a very simple way.
So Phil, I think we all understand your position. You think that what you drafted works. And then as other people have looked to profile, and
it's the proposal that covers everybody's use cases, whereas the proposal put forward, the alternate proposal, says, now I really feel like a square peg in a round hole where I'm going to shear off my sides in order to get it to work.
and yeah, I mean, it may not be working for our other profiles. And I think that one of the aspects is that as the profiles dug into exactly how would they go and use SET, is they found challenges in how that actually, you know, as they were looking to implement and actually get into the details, they came up with issues. And as people put up, you know, Annabelle's proposal may not work for SCIM, and that may drive the fact that there isn't nearly as much commonality in the SET between SCIM and RISC as people might have originally thought.
Phil, I think
I'm Dick, you're Phil.
I'm Phil. Phil here.
Yeah.
I think the example you're referring to was RISC's analysis of this, and I have to point out that the RISC working group hasn't agreed that conveying one event URI is appropriate there at all. We don't agree there, so we don't agree here.
Sure.
To say that RISC analyzed it and came to that conclusion would be a mischaracterization.
People in RISC analyzed it and had a different conclusion. Yes.
We have the people in RISC analyzed it, and
Some
many
of the
RISC
people had
people have differing conclusions.
Well, one, there isn't even a SCIM working group looking at it yet. So I know, but there isn't really. You phrase that it doesn't work for you or work for SCIM, but I don't have an analysis. It's Tony's turn, and we've got like 2 minutes.
Respond, because you're mischaracterizing my words. I said specifically in the RISC working group, we don't agree with that conclusion.
Okay. Not disagreeing with that.
Tony Nadlin. So,
Hi, Tony.
hi, Dick. Some of the, I guess, you know, this work started over in the SCIM working group, and, you know, we had plenty of ideas there on how to use events with SCIM, and it's, you know, other ideas have come into this group, all, you know, into this working group since it got formed based upon the SCIM work. And so, yeah, so things, yes, sorry, I'm talking, you mind? Jeez. That's fine. And so, you know, some of the people's thoughts are just, you know, different than what it all started out to be. You know, and, you know, we use this for both, you know, what we've been doing works for both the enterprise and also the consumer, because this is what we use it in. And so to limit it, you know, just to RISC, I think is a bad approach.
Limit which?
The whole design to just basically redoing what's been going on over in the RISC working group.
Marius Cortescu. I just want to highlight the fact that the proposals to simplify the set comes from two companies who are actually doing an actual implementation right now. So this is feedback after implementing this and deploying these things, and it's early feedback from implementation, and we're keep ignoring that. So that's going to come up as more people implement this. And yeah, that's all I want to say.
Thanks. Yeah. I think implementation feedback is super useful.
John Bradley, Yubico. So way back in the dark days when there was a SCIM working group still, there was a conversation that happened between the OpenID Connect working group, which needed to do a back channel logout, i.e. send a JOT from the identity provider to the relying party to say, this login has been revoked, terminate the session. And we looked around and said, well, we could just send an ID token with an additional claim saying log out. Seems simple enough. But then I had a conversation with Leif, and we said, maybe there's some combination. We shouldn't necessarily try and do something separate. There's already a control channel that's happening back using SCIM. Is there some way that we could use SCIM? Using SCIM itself turned out to be way more complicated than anybody was interested in deploying. So then we started, well, what about the SCIM messaging thing that hadn't really caught on at that point? And then other people have piled on.
So John,
it hadn't caught on
John has a mic.
It hadn't caught
We're over
on.
time, so if you could just let us know what your point is here, John.
No. My point is that we have attempted to work together. If as this work group is sort of taken off, what's largely happened is that SET has gotten so complicated with the management API, it may not actually be plausibly deployable as an OpenID Connect back channel logout mechanism, because no one is going to be willing to deploy all of the extra functionality, which is, I think, some of the point that Annabelle and others are trying to make. So it may actually, at the end of the day, you may be correct that maybe we do have square pegs and round holes between some of the simple messaging things that we want to do and some of the more complete functionality that the enterprise SCIM folks have in mind.
Thank you. We're out of time. Thank you, everybody. I will work to create a doc on what I think is where we have common agreement to see how much that is and post that to the list, and we'll have discussion on the list. We'll also see if we can have maybe an ad hoc meeting posted that I'll post on the list for later this week to see if we can drive into some of this more.